Yeah, so welcome everyone to NOHVC's webinar series. This is, I believe, our sixth one. We're delighted with the way it's going. We're getting good participation. See some repeat customers, so hopefully we're providing some good information. And I'm delighted about tonight's webinar in particular because we have a special guest who's helping us out with the effective OHV economic impact studies topic. And frankly, when staff first proposed that NOHVC begin a webinar series, we brought it up to Dan Clean, the NOHVCC chairman, and he suggested right away that we needed to get Mark on to do a webinar about this topic. And so we're happy to have him. His name is Mark Emmerman. He's with Regional Strategic Limited, and he's done quite a bit of work in the area of economic impact, and he's going to tell you about some work he did in Iowa recently. And I don't want to belabor this, but we're just happy to have him. Know he has a tremendous amount of knowledge and look forward to hearing from him ourselves, and hope you guys get as much information from him and take as much away in lessons learned as we have. So without much further ado, I'll turn it over to him. But I will say we do need to cover a ground rule or two. Typically, the way we do our webinars is we'll try to mute everyone and let the speaker have the floor throughout the presentation. If you have questions, you'll notice a chat feature. On my computer, at least, it's on the right side, and you can type questions into there. In almost every circumstance, we'll get to the questions at the end of the webinar and go through them, and Mark will have the answers, I suppose, and we'll get you what you're looking for. In rare cases, if there's something that's super topical, myself or Laura will try to catch it and butt in with Mark, but mostly we'll have all the questions towards the end. So if you could keep yourself on mute, it'll keep the line quieter and give Mark the space to give his presentation. So with that, Mark, you want to take it away?
Okay, thank you. Appreciate the introduction. It's always scary to follow somebody that says you've got that much talent. So hopefully I can make that work. I appreciate being here today. This little presentation is going to take a quick look at economic impact and contribution studies, how they get put together and how they work. Then we're going to take a little bit of time to look at a recent study that we did for Regional Strategic did for the Iowa Off-Highway Vehicle Association. I've got about 22 slides on economic impact, how it works, and what we did in Iowa. And then I've got a few slides on the demographic information and policy information we collected in Iowa. If we run out of time, we will just skip the last 6 slides or so. So here we go. Next slide, please, Laura. Economic impact and contribution studies are basically the same thing. The difference is an impact study generally is used, that terminology is used when you're predicting something that doesn't exist in the economy now. We're going to bring in a new factory. We're going to start doing something different with agricultural products. An impact study is to predict the impact of something new. A contribution study is to show how much of the economy goes through a certain industry or a certain business. So what we did with the Iowa Off-Highway Vehicle Association is really a contribution study. Other than that, they are virtually the same. It's a terminology difference. If you get in the wrong academic areas, it's very important. In the real world, it doesn't bother many people. Next slide. Contribution or impact studies work in that whenever I spend money, you have money to spend. And if you spend that money, somebody else has money to spend. And it's just a money ground. So what the study does is it follows and adds up the money that's spent in an area after an initial expenditure. The size of that contribution depends on how much of the initial expenditure stays in the area and how much of the money staying in the area is respent as opposed to being saved. Any money that goes out of the area leaves the system and no longer contributes. Any money that goes into your bank account leaves the system and no longer contributes. There are benefits to both imports and banking, but they don't help the contribution study. Next slide. This is a little diagram basically of how a system works. On the left, you've got the direct effect, which is the initial money spent. And that's either spent on local purchases or non-local consumption in that second box on the left side. And non-local money goes out of the system, the arrows going out the top. Anything spent in the system is either spent on goods and services and goes into an industry matrix that shows that tells how it gets spent through the production system, or it goes to labor and it gets spent on groceries, bowling alleys, dance lessons, and whatever else. What we do is we follow those two streams of money for as long as they stay in the area. We add them up, and then on the right hand, you get direct effects, which is what was originally spent, indirect effects, which is the input products that are bought, the input supply products that are bought as part of the process. And induced effects are the effects of people spending their payroll money or their incomes on those dance lessons, the bowling, the groceries, and all that sort of stuff. And altogether, it's the total impact. You always want to watch when you do one of these, or if you read one of these, watch the money that goes out of the system. Yes? You want to watch the money that goes out of the system, the little arrows at the top, because the size and speed with which money goes out of the system reduces your impact and determines where this all stops. You can simply increase the geographic size of your area and reduce outflows. But if you really want local impacts, it's best to find an area that really fits with where your funding or your activities are. Next slide, please. These transactions all get measured using a matrix and matrix algebra, which is more than we're going to get into deeply here. But this slide and the next one both show 4 pictures of a very simple economy. This economy has 4 production sectors and 1 household sector, so there's 5 sectors total. In the top half of this slide is the economy as we start. The rows across for every industry show where that industry sells its output. The columns down for every industry show where that industry gets its inputs. That's why they call these input-output models. In that top version, we did everything in terms of 1 unit apiece. So we've got an economy where total supply and total demand are both 20 units. For our purposes in that second box, the lower one, we're just going to assume that households quit buying off-highway vehicles, which means that down in the lower right, we changed a 1 to a 0. Okay, that changes total output in the economy to 19 and total demand in the economy to 19, and those balance. But household income is now lower than what the households are putting into the economy as inputs. And off-highway vehicle demand is less than what off-highway vehicle production is. So there's things that have to be adjusted in the economy. So we took 1 unit of demand and production out. We balanced at 19 instead of 20. Next slide, please. Now in the top half of this one, we fix our off-highway vehicle input problem. Since we've only got demand for 3 off-highway vehicles now, we cut our inputs in every level from 1 to 0.75. So now I've got 3 off-highway vehicles produced and 3 are demanded. And that gets me down to 18 units in my economy from 20. I've still got a problem with household demand and household income. They're still separated by, that'd be the bottom of the total demand column and the right-hand side of the total supply row. Households are only receiving 3 units of stuff, but they've got, or they're putting 3.75 units of inputs into the economy, and they're only consuming 3 units because they're not doing off-highway vehicles. So in the bottom half, we change the household's allocation of its activities to the economy, and we change that to 0.75 for every sector instead of 1. Okay, now my off-highway vehicles and my households all balance at 3 units of supply and demand. My total economy is only 17.25 units, both supply and demand. Everything balances here. The point of this slide is that we took 1 unit of demand, household demand, out of the economy. Okay, we quit buying off-highway vehicles and households. But instead of just having a drop in the size of the economy of 1 unit, we ended up with a drop that is 2.75 units. And that's because of the indirect and the induced effects of the direct effect that we threw in, the reduction of 1 unit of the economy. So a direct effect of 1 unit caused 2.75 units of decline in the economy. We can say that household consumption of off-highway vehicles in this simple model caused 2.75, or was responsible for 2.75 units of the total economy. Okay. If you all have seen multipliers in a study like that, that would be a multiplier of 2.75. We changed the economy household consumption by 1. It had a 2.75 effect on the overall economy. That's the way this model works out. You'll never see a multiplier of 2.75 in the real world. We've got a little economy with no exports, no imports, no savings, no taxes. This is as big as multipliers will get. So, but anyway, that's how an input-output model works. Next slide. So this slide just talks about what happened again, and we already just went through that. We went from 20 units, we took 1 unit of household demand out, and by the time we balanced it all, we had an economy that was only 17.25 units of supply and demand, or we lost 2.75. We lost over 10% of the economy, right? We only took 5% of the economy out in terms of demand, but we lost over 10%. That's how input-output models work, and that's how impact or contribution studies work. Can we go to the next slide? Now, at Regional Strategic, we generally use IMPLAN models to do this. IMPLAN was started at the University of Minnesota on a contract with the federal government about 40 years ago. It's now maintained in North Carolina at the universities down there, and it's now a private business, but it's still based on federal input-output models that are developed for the economy as a whole. There are other options, and if you talk to somebody about doing an impact or a contribution model, the options you're generally going to get tossed to you are really 4. One is IMPLAN. We use it because it has a feature set that's very robust for a cost that we think is affordable. And it has uniform coverage across the United States. Across Canada, the majority of Western Europe now, they keep expanding it. So I heard somebody earlier say they were from Australia. I'm not sure whether Australia is in the process in that system yet or not, but that's what we use. A more complicated model is REMI, which is Regional Economic Modeling Incorporated out of Massachusetts. It's a very complex model, and it is an expensive option. The last I saw, you had to get a license for every time you ran it, and we ran implant 16 times for Iowa. It would have probably broken the national budget to use REMI. A cheaper option is to use regional input-output multipliers from the U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis. They're generally called RIMS multipliers, for regional input-output multiplier system. Those are relatively cheap to buy. They're quite a bit cheaper than implant. The problem is you get the data, but you have to build your own matrix system. And once the matrix system is built, it's fixed. You don't have many options to change inputs and outputs once you run it. Again, that's a problem if, like for Iowa, we did 16 runs on the model. The last thing you generally see in models is somebody says, well, local developers told us that we'd have a multiplier of about 2. That's usually not very good, because everybody says they have a multiplier of 2, and multipliers of 2 are really rather rare in subnational economies. You very seldom see them. So that's your options. Implan has 528 industry sectors. Our little model in the last slides had 4. Implan has 9 categories for households based on incomes. We had 1. It also accounts for taxes, capital expenditures, profits, and a number of other things going on. And it all happens automatically. Once you have all your parameters set and you hit run, within a few seconds, it will throw your output back at you. So that's what you're going to see if you look to get an impact model done. You're going to run from implant to REMI to RIMS to just somebody told me what the multiplier was. Next slide, please. Okay, we've talked about what how an economic impact model works, and that was really the tedious part of the, I would suppose, the tedious part of the presentation for most of you. Now we're going to talk about what you need to have to do one. If you were to pick up somebody like me or any one of a number of vendors that do these sorts of things, this gives you an idea of the sorts of information you want to be able to get your hands on. We did surveys in Iowa we sent surveys out to 1,500 owners. And what we wanted to know was for 2018, how much money they spent on off-highway vehicles, fuel and fluids, parts supplies, dealer service fees, trailers, buildings, licenses and registration, all of that stuff that's specific to the machine. And then we asked them questions about, okay, when you're riding, what do you spend on yourself? Do you buy special clothing? Do you buy helmets? Do you take your off-highway vehicles to Nebraska or Montana or Canada to ride them? When you do, how much do you spend on fuel to transport? How much do you spend on lodging, meals, entertainment, permits and fees? We actually found out that people that take their off-highway vehicles out of Iowa spend as much on permits and fees where they travel to as they do on their registrations in state, which I found was fascinating. We also asked for capital expenditures that they had invested. If a off-highway vehicle owner has a special building for their vehicle, if they have a trailer they bought 3 years ago for their vehicle, those aren't things that show up in an economic impact for 2018. But it is worthwhile to show what the in-place investment is in off-highway vehicles. That's useful for 2 reasons. One is it's very useful for policy purposes. So, you know, these folks are in it for the long haul. They've got the X number of dollars invested permanently in this recreation. It also allows the modeler to take the current impact where they figure out what did you spend on buildings in 2018? What did you spend on trailers in 2018? How many vehicles did you buy in 2018? If you have an idea of what the fixed investment is prior to 2018, it tells you whether your investment in 2018, your survey results for 2018, makes sense with what else you know. It's one of the ways that a good modeler looks around the system and says, this is a whole piece of cloth, instead of I've got threads going everywhere and they don't really match up. Okay. We also asked all of this stuff for people on all of their numbers for what they spent out of state. So we did a model run for their in-state expenditures and their out-of-state expenditures, and those results have to be utilized differently, and we'll explain them in a little bit. Next slide, please. Okay, then we took all the data from the surveys, or wherever you get your estimates, but in this case, most of you are going to probably do some sort of survey. We took those survey results and then we applied them or expanded them to the entire off-highway vehicle owner or rider population. And whether you do that to vehicles or whether you do that to riders depends on how you collect your information. We collected information by vehicle, and the reason we picked vehicles is we had some official numbers on vehicle numbers. You've got registration information, you've got title information. So if you ask all of your information on vehicles, you've got a solid foundation to take that back to. We took the total estimated expenditures, and for every category, we matched those to the appropriate industry and in-plan. Remember, there were 528 industry classifications in in-plan. We were able to get these all pretty close to where they needed to be. One of the advantages of in-plan, if you're doing this for something besides off-highway vehicles, or if you're doing this for a new impact study, is if I had something that was completely out of line with any of my industries, I could create an industry. That's usually something you do for impact studies where you're bringing something new in rather than for contribution studies, but it is possible. We accounted for any special circumstances. In this case, we really didn't have any. If you do ag studies in the Midwest in the United States, you have to deal with the fact that a certain amount of grain is going to be produced regardless of what happens. So some things that utilize grain don't actually add to production, and you have to account for that. But in this model, we didn't have to. Then we ran the model. And in Iowa, we ran the model, as I said before, 16 times. Next slide, please. Here's how the Iowa study fell out. On November 8th, 2018, we sent out 1,500 surveys. We did paper surveys. It had been a couple of years since I'd done recreation, and the last time I'd done it, we had run into an issue where we had a population that wasn't ready for online surveys yet, so we did paper. I think given our response, we would probably go back to online, at least in Iowa, unless it was a reason specifically for an area not to. Before the surveys went out, we sent advance postcards to tell people they were coming. And after they went out, we sent two postcards post-survey to remind people to send those surveys back. By December 31st, we had 302 surveys response. That was 20.3%, which is a very good survey response. As you'll see there, all-terrain vehicle owners gave us 21.4%. Off-road motorcycle owners gave us 20.2%, and side-by-side owners came 18.8%. And we use those responses to make the estimates that we have. Next survey, or next slide. Okay, here's a quick look at Iowa's off-highway vehicles. I've got them split into registered and unregistered machines. And you'll notice that we've got 43,410 registered machines, and there's 115,687 unregistered machines on the title list. That's 2.66 unregistered machines for every registered machine. We went into this knowing that there were some unregistered machines, but not believing it was an overwhelming population. And we originally did this. I bid this job at 8 runs of the model. We were going to run the impact model for all-terrain vehicles, for off-road motorcycles, for side-by-sides, and a total. And we were going to do that for both in-state and out-of-state expenditures. And we were going to do that on the basis of a survey of registered vehicle owners. Had the results for that, presented this to the Motorcycle Dealers Association Board in early January. And they were just pretty convinced that there were way more unregistered vehicles out there than we thought. And so we did some checking and we found out there were way more unregistered vehicles out there than we thought. But we had surveyed registered vehicle owners. And the easiest thing to do is just multiply everything by 3.66, because there's 2.66 unregistered vehicles for every registered vehicle. But that didn't seem fair to us, because there's reasons people don't register their machines. Maybe some of them aren't active anymore, but they don't want to turn the title in. Maybe they don't ride them in public places, so they don't need to register them. So what we decided to do was we had our registered machine results, and then we made an assumption that 75% of the unregistered machines were active. The other side of that coin is that 25% of them were mothballed in a shed somewhere. And then we made the assumption, since registration, being unregistered gets you fines if you're caught in public, we made the assumption that unregistered machines were only active 75% as much as registered machines. We made the assumption because you'd expect them not to be out in public. They wouldn't be as recreational. So those assumptions we made. I think those were both very conservative. And you'll hear me say conservative a lot here. I don't like to ask people to stick their necks out and go to a public policy making body with information that they're going to get shot down on. I'd rather have them consistently say, these numbers are significant and they're conservative, than to go out and not be able to explain what they have. So those are the assumptions we made there. So the estimates that you see from here on out are based on all the machines, but we diluted down the unregistered machines, assuming 25% of them were mothballed and the other 75% of them were only operated at 75% of the level that registered machines are. If we were to do this again, I think the Iowa Association would agree with me. It'd be nice to try to do a smaller survey of the unregistered machine owners. That's a more expensive survey to do because you only title your machine once, and when it's 10 years old, chances are probably 30% that you've moved. So we had almost no undeliverable surveys to registered machines. I would expect that we would get at least 30% on deliverables if we started surveying titles. Next slide, please. This is our survey distribution. We took the registered vehicles, and the first column shows the number of registered vehicles in all our categories. The second column shows how many of those registrations were to corporations, and they totaled 2,340 machines. We took those out of the population. We only surveyed to machine owners or machines that were titled to individuals. A couple of reasons for that. One is corporate machines would be used significantly differently. And the second is the corporate address on the title is very likely not going to get you to somebody that is competent or interested in filling out the survey. And interested is one thing, you know, even individuals, some of them weren't interested in filling out the survey. But the corporate address, if you send a survey to the corporate address, whoever opens the mail might have no idea who would know how to answer it. So we just took them out. Then we figured what the shares of individual titles were or registrations were, and sent out surveys based on those shares. We sent 755 surveys to all-terrain vehicle owners, 186 to off-road motorcycle owners, and 559 to side-by-side owners. Everybody that got a survey was asked to respond for every vehicle they owned, regardless of type. And there is a lot of crossover. Lots of folks had multiple vehicles of multiple types. They all got the same survey. We separated them out by the postage stamps on the survey that was returned. Every class of owners had a different postage stamp. That way you can differentiate your responses without having it look like you did anything. Next slide, please. We already went through response rates a little bit. We had an overall response rate of over 20%. All-terrain vehicles were the biggest responders. Side-by-sides were a little lower, but by and large, we had great responses from everybody. This is something about the commitment of off-highway vehicle owners in Iowa. And also I want to give a big thanks to the Iowa Motorcycle Dealers Association. They provided 6 $50 gift cards that were raffled off to respondents that gave us their names. And I'm sure that boosted response rates. Next slide. From our responses, the 302 responses, we got information on 335 ATVs, 155 side-by-sides, and 164 off-road motorcycles. We also got information on the vehicles that these folks purchased new in 2018 and what they paid for those new vehicles in 2018, and that gave us average new prices for all of these vehicles. We got 2.17, almost 2.2 vehicles per respondent. And that's conservative. I got more than one response that said they had sold their vehicles since our list was drawn. And that's fair. Our vehicles get traded all the time. But to fully count people, you have to have some way to bring in new vehicles that were purchased since the list was drawn, and we had no way to do that. So that again is conservative. There are lots of little things here that give just enough of a conservative bent on this to help make it credible. Next slide, please. Now we took those average prices for 2018 purchases and we went back to the registration list for each vehicle type and got the number of vehicles that were bought and registered new. multiplied them out. And we got $58.5 million spent on new vehicles, new off-highway vehicles by Iowa riders in 2018. The lion's share of this was on side-by-sides. And from what we saw in survey responses and what I saw in registrations, that is the area with natural growth in the market right now. Side-by-sides are very popular vehicles. I'm going to admit that I'm not a rider, so I don't know for sure why, but I can look at them and see that there are a lot of things they can do. Next slide, please. I'm going to take just a minute here. I think I just talked about this slide. Did I get one ahead? Here, estimated 2000. Yeah, we had the average new survey value, and we talked about this. This is the 58,000. Here's where I am. Here's where, hopefully we didn't get anybody too confused here. In addition to new vehicles purchased, we took all our survey information and we figured out how much every rider was spending per machine on their operating expenditures, on their personal expenses, their helmets, their gloves, their lodging and travel, and their estimated expenses on buildings and trailers and basically capital expenses. And we found that per machine for all-terrain vehicles, they were spending about $607 in-state and about $187 out-of-state. And for off-road motorcycles, in-state per machine about $983 and out-of-state about $229. And for side-by-sides, in-state about $1,330 and out-of-state about $502. That's significant. If you figure your per vehicle expenditures, that's what we went back and applied to all the vehicles we had. The expenditures were applied in full to the registered machines and on the discounted basis we talked about for the unregistered machines. Next slide, please. Okay. These are the estimated total expenditures. The last slide was expenditures per machine. This includes the operating and the personal expenses that we had on the last slide. It includes the non-machine capital expenses from the last slide. And close to the bottom there, it includes the vehicle purchases from 2 slides ago. Okay. So total expenditures in-state, out-of-state, and new vehicle purchases were $55.4 million for all-terrain vehicles, $20.2 million for off-road motorcycles, and $100.4 million for side-by-sides. And that's Iowa expenditures in 2018 for all off-highway vehicles were $175 million, which is substantial. So almost $176 million. That would be your direct expense. Your direct expense, when we go back to that first picture we had on slide 3 or 4, where the money starts through the system, that's what starts it all. Next slide, please. Okay, we put this all in the system. And I took all those expenditures and put them on the proper industries, and I set the models up and I ran the model a lot of times. But we got, this is the output, okay? Our expenditure of $176 million, Iowa owner expenditures on off-highway vehicles, generated 1,018 jobs in the Iowa economy. Okay. It generated about $42 million in payroll. That means those jobs were good for about $41,110 a piece in earnings. Output, total output from those expenditures was, and output is the industrial output in the state, what the state produces total, was $123 million, $123.25 million. Okay. And the value added there, the second column from the right, was $71.25 million. Now, value added is a portion of output that's actually created in Iowa, right? If I build an ATV in Iowa, I'm going to buy some of the parts from out of state. If I run an ATV in Iowa and I use fuel, Iowa doesn't produce any petroleum. So this is the value added is the portion that actually is produced in state. And of that $71 million in value added, almost 42 million of that went right into Iowa labor, right into people's wages. So next slide. Okay, this is where modelers get in trouble. You might have noticed that in-state off-highway vehicle expenditures totaled 147 million, and that in-state total associated output was only $123 million. And if you did, you might ask if somebody's taken the Iowa off-highway vehicle owners for a ride, or is the modeler a bozo, or any of that. And the answer to the first of those is definitely no. And the second of those is we hope not, but we'll leave that to all of you. The reasons that total Iowa economic output is less than the expenditure is because of retail margins and industrial sourcing. Remember that third slide or fourth slide where we had the picture of the model and the direct impact, the money spent. The first thing it did was went into purchases, and some of those purchases went right out of state, and some of those purchases were made in state, and some of the purchases that were made in state, the retail purchases that were made in state, some of that money goes right out of state for cost of goods sold. And for anything that is heavily retail driven, which this model was, you will have a lot of money that goes right through as cost of goods sold and goes right out of state, which leaks right away. And that's where this difference is. Next slide. Whenever you buy something retail, the retailing sector of the economy doesn't create goods, it sources goods. Its contribution is the service it provides by making those goods available, and it's measured by the retail margin, and that margin is the value that's kept by the retailer after paying for goods sold. In our model, $58.5 million of that 175 direct expenditure was for brand new machines. 45.6 million of that was cost of goods sold and went right out of the model. 11.6 million of our 175 was fuel and fluids. 9.7 million of that was cost of goods sold, and it went right out of the model. Okay. So anytime you do anything with retailing, we also had clothing, parts, supplies. When you deal with retailing, you've got to look at cost of goods sold and where those goods come from. Next slide. Now that doesn't mean it all disappears. if your retail pass-through is captured in an area where there's active manufacturing, some of it goes back in the model. Of the 45.6 million in vehicle purchases that passed through the retail, 42.5 million was for ATVs and side-by-sides. Iowa has active manufacturing for those vehicles. And the model estimates, the economic estimates are that almost 12% of those purchases were manufactured in Iowa. So that 5 million goes back into the model. But off-road motorcycles don't have anything that goes back in the model because Iowa doesn't manufacture any of them. All of the cost of goods sold leaves. Gasoline doesn't come back in the model because Iowa doesn't produce any. So that all goes out of the model. That's why sometimes you see a final output number that's lower than your actual expenditure. And when you look at models, and if you do a model like this, you want to watch for that because a lot of folks don't want to explain how that works, and they'll juggle your direct numbers, or they'll juggle your retail margins, so that doesn't show up, and that almost always gives you an overestimate of what the value of your industrial sector is. The other trick to taking care of that is you just bypass the retail sector and you take it all direct to the manufacturing industries, and that also overestimates your impacts. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so we just talked about this a little. This is common problems with impact and contribution estimates. And the first one is if you don't do a good survey. If you don't have a survey where you can confidently match your results to the population, you have a problem. The second is you don't use a model at all. Somebody in local economic development tells you that, well, the multiplier is 2, or the multiplier is 2.25. And you just take your survey and you multiply it. And that's not good either, but it's very inexpensive. I mean, I understand why it gets done, is it's a lot cheaper than running the model. The third one is that retail margins are set to 100%, which means that there is no cost of goods sold. And all of your retail purchases go direct into store labor, basically, which gives you a very good multiplier, but that's not the way the economy works. And the fourth one is that all retail purchases are just allocated directly to manufacturing. All of these will probably overstate your final contribution estimates. The first two substantially reduce the costs of creating those estimates. The last two, it happens. I don't think it's dishonest. I think it generally happens when a modeler looks at what they put into the model and what they got out of it, and they can't reconcile it in their own head. One of the things to watch out for when you do these is, particularly with RIMS and IMPLAN, over the last 15 years, the pricing structure has changed to where almost anybody can buy an economic model, and almost anybody can plug numbers into an economic model, and almost anybody can take output out of an economic model, whether they understand how the model works or the local economy, either one. So those are things just to keep your eye on. Next slide, please. Okay, this talks about other benefits of a good initial survey. It needs to accurately catch your expenditures. It can also be used to collect a vast amount of policy information on owner-operator, age, sex, income, education, their willingness to fund infrastructure development, their willingness to pay registration fees. One of the things we did in Iowa was asked very specific questions about what people were willing to do for registration fees. And then we thought about that from a policy perspective on whether it made sense to raise registration fees, whether it might make more sense to increase enforcement and get more unregistered machines registered. if you're going to do a good survey anyway, you might as well get some good political information out of it. Now, this is where I said I had about 22 slides on the economic impact model. The next 6 slides are here, and they just give examples of some of the demographic stuff we took off the Iowa study. I am at about 50 minutes here, and I'm going to give you all a chance to ask questions and try to answer them. I understand that the National Association is going to put this webinar up on their website. And if I'm wrong on that, somebody cut me off before I get you in trouble. But these slides will be there if you want to look at them. And if you want, that will also have my contact information. So if you have questions in the future, you can ask me then. But for right now, we'll look at questions.
Okay, this is Dwayne again. Thank you, Mark. That was outstanding. I've been looking at economic impact studies my entire career, and thought I knew what they were about. And now you've cleared up a lot of things, and I think gave us all a lot to think about. And I really attracted to what you said about conservative estimates. I think all of us on the phone, and when we set out to do one of these things, we're not hoping to get a small number. We all want the biggest number we can possibly come up with. However, once that huge number has whole shot in it because we didn't get somebody like you to come in and do some good modeling, it's basically ineffective. And so I think that's a great message that we should be conservative with our OHV economic impact studies. We don't have any questions at the moment that have been typed into the chat feature, but if anybody has a question, get typing right now, and we'll make sure that Mark gets a chance to answer them. I, for one, am really impressed. I thought that was a very, very thorough examination of how these studies come about. And like I said, I learned a lot, and I hope others did as well. And we do have a question. And the question is, please talk about what specifications a government agency should consider including in a contract for an economic contribution survey.
Okay, what sorts of things a government agency should consider including in a contract for an economic impact study? You should specifically identify what industry or what sector, what activity you're looking at. I get a lot of first requests from people that aren't very specific on what they want. They might say, I want to know what a highway from Des Moines to Ottumwa will generate for impacts, without any idea on what sorts of changes are going to be made there. If you want to do a contribution study, if we're going to do a contribution study for off-highway vehicles, one of the things that I see in a lot of the contribution studies, recent contribution studies for off-highway vehicles, is that they are just set up for off-highway vehicles. And off-road motorcycles and side-by-sides are much different from all-terrain vehicles in terms of the expense, in terms of how many of them are bought. One of the things that impressed me with the Iowa group was they came in and asked immediately about just a general study. And when I got back to them, then they came back and said, well, what we really want to know is we want to know what all-terrain vehicles are and what off-road motorcycles are, and we want to deal with all of those folks. So very specific on that, very specific on a timeline, because if a survey has to be done, it takes a certain amount of time to put it together. It takes a certain amount of time to get it either mailed out or to push people into your online system. And then it takes a significant amount of time to analyze the data before we even run the models. So that's important. What you want to use the study for tells the modeler a little bit on how they want to get the survey questions asked and how they want to compile the data when it's done. those sorts of things. I think, for starters, that's the most important parts.
Thank you. We have another question. It is, was it difficult to obtain vehicle title or registration information from the Iowa Motor Vehicle Department?
No. In fact, we didn't. In Iowa, it's not at the Motor Vehicle Department. It's from the Iowa Department of Natural Resources, and they were very good about getting us vehicle information. Dan Clean got that initially for me, and the first time through, they gave us a list of, they gave us the whole population, but they gave us a truncated bunch of fields, so I didn't have all the information on the machines. And when I saw that, and I turned around and asked Dan if he could ask him to give us everything, it was as fast as it got through the system. I had a list of everything on registered machines. We didn't ask for titles right away because we didn't think there were a lot more titled machines than registered. We didn't ask for that until January 8th, when I thought I was about done with this study. And the motorcycle dealer said, wait a minute, there's a bigger population. And so we asked for titles then. And it only took us about a day to get the total number of titles. Since I wasn't surveying them, I didn't ask for the total database, but I think I would have gotten it. So that was very easy in Iowa. If you're in the United States anyway, a registered vehicle is a public record. If you do have trouble with it, you should remind them that that's something they have to give you. That's why we all get phone calls about extended warranties on our cars. Is every day an insurance company goes to the State Department of Motor Vehicles and dumps the whole car registration list. They know that I own a Nissan that's out of warranty. So don't hesitate to remind people in the United States that that's a public record and they have to give it to you.
Thank you. Next question. It appears that the most difficult and important step is to collect highly accurate information from those people being surveyed. Even on a sincere best effort basis, are they likely to report accurately, and how do you test for accuracy?
As a general rule, and particularly a group like this, I think we get good information. I think the self-reporting problems that you get on survey data get larger as respondents see a personal return or value in one outcome or another. This population didn't have a direct monetary interest in this, other than the fact that they did want to have some policy decisions made and things. So I think we got accurate information. I think one of the things that made me think this was accurate information was the high proportion. The majority of them all said that they would pay higher registration fees. That's not holding it very close to the vest, actually. So that was good. The other thing I mentioned earlier is, while we asked what people spent on things in 2018, we also asked what their total standing investment was in every one of those categories. All right. So we asked if they built a building for their machines in 2018, but we also asked, do you have buildings? Do you have existing buildings? Did you buy machines in 2018, but do you have existing machines, parts, supplies, clothing, everything? So you can go back and look at, do their current purchases make sense in conjunction, or when you look at them with historical stuff. And a lot of that just has to do with asking things in multiple ways and making sure the answers are consistent. I am currently also working on a conservation study in Iowa agriculture. And that's a place where people do have a very vested interest in how things work out. There's nothing right or wrong about it, but that's just the way it is. But you ask them open-ended questions about a subject, and then you ask them to lay out a budget for something, and you see whether the open-ended questions and the budgets go the same direction. And very few respondents are strategic enough that they will consistently keep those sets of answers the same if they're not being forthright. So those are some things you do.
Thank you. Next question. Did you receive any data from the Motorcycle Industry Council or the Specialty Vehicle Institute of America regarding OHV sales in Iowa to serve as a sanity check on Iowa MVD data?
You mean, did I check sales against registered vehicles, new registrations?
I think that's the crux of the question.
No, we didn't. No, we didn't. I had no contact with any manufacturers at all during the course of this study.
Excellent. That's the last of the questions that we have on here. And we're at an hour and 2 minutes now. We scheduled an hour, so we pretty much nailed it. I just want to once again say thank you. And I also want to put a plug out that Mark is going to join us in Reno to give this or a very similar presentation at our conference. I think it'll be instructive to a lot of people. So if you're on the webinar and hadn't been planning to attend, this is just one of the great topics that will be covered by a great presenter. And once again, I just want to really thank you, Mark, for taking the time to do this. We know that you could help in a professional capacity for anybody who wanted to have something similar to that was done in Iowa in their own states, but you didn't have to give us the entire playbook and let us know what's involved. So we're really appreciative and recognize that you took time out of your schedule to help a group of OHVers who are very thankful. So
I was happy to do it, and honestly, I would be happy to help anybody that wants help with it. But my major goal here was, if you want to do this and you're going to go look for somebody to do it, some things to look for when you talk to somebody to do it, because this is really for your organization, so they know what they're looking for when they go looking. And I really appreciate the opportunity to talk to you, and I do appreciate being asked to come to Reno. Thank you.
And guys, just if I can quick, I just wanted to chime in and thank Mark as well. And also just to share what we already put this impact study and information to work on. That we met with the Iowa Department of Natural Resources Natural Resource Committee, who approves our parks and stuff. And when we laid this out, they were just blown away with the amount of impact that our sport is there, and that we are a sport that pays our own way, and it was just very good information. We also plan on sharing it with our legislators. We tried to this year, but got snowed out of all of our legislative breakfast dates. But it's very valuable information for us, and just wanted to thank Mark again, and hope everybody can get that information in their states or territories. So thanks again, Mark.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate it.
Thank you, everyone. And we'll be scheduling a webinar for next month coming up soon. So look for an email coming over the normal NOVAC pipelines and up on our website pretty soon. Thank you. Good night.